As you know, over the last 2 years, the world has been impacted in many different ways by the pandemic. Besides the tragic health issues and stress on the health systems around the world, the pandemic has affected the economic, the social and emotional well-being of society. The social, cultural and economic system we knew has been destabilized probably for the longer term due to the pandemic. Unfortunately, today there are other forces that are also impacting long-term and destabilizing, and we will probably have questions about that later as well. As far as education is concerned, and due to school and university closures, many young people have been deprived from the opportunity to benefit from the kind of education they dreamed of. University leaders, the students, the staff have been faced with ongoing challenges to address. They've also been met with new opportunities to explore different ways of operating that actually has challenged the ways in which they operated normally. The contexts in which universities operate remain rather unpredictable even today, and the sector needs to continue to be very flexible and innovative. The current situation calls for an in-depth reflection on how to build back better. The pandemic has accelerated change, including in higher education, and there is a need for thorough understanding and exchange about where we are today and how to prepare for the future. Education has to be reimagined in order to better fulfill the expectations of society at large. Indeed, we're at a very important moment of time when we can learn from the unprecedented global crisis we experience. So we have to learn, we have to change, we have to gather quality data also on how the current crisis impacts higher education at all the levels, at the institutional level, at the national level, at regional level. And all of these data will help understand what disruptions have been brought about by the pandemic and what needs to be done to ensure that the sector delivers on its promises for the future. And it's in that context that the International Association of Universities is very pleased today to share the outcomes of the second global survey on the impact of COVID-19 on higher education. And I'm very pleased to be here today with you, with Trine Jensen, who's the manager, higher education and digital transformation, publications and events at the IAU, and with Giorgio Marinoni, the manager, higher education and internationalization policy and projects at the IAU, who are actually the two main authors of this survey report. It is the second one, and it will be possible at some points during the presentation to also make some comparison with the first global survey. And it's the second in a series of three. There are three global surveys that we've envisaged so far. One that took place at the very beginning of the pandemic, one that was unfolding the last year and has now been analyzed, and the report will be made available this afternoon. And a third global survey will be carried in a year or so from now. We won't give a time because we don't know when the pandemic really will be over. Thanks to the rich data set collected from around the world and 1 year into the pandemic, this report will, we hope, offer a real comprehensive understanding of the complex and interlinked impacts of the crisis on four main areas of concern: higher education, governance, teaching and learning, research, and community and societal engagement. So we hope you will be triggered to ask many questions during the presentation that will be made by Trine and Giorgio. But let's start the presentation right now. So next slide, please. So the first survey that I introduced just a minute ago was conducted in 2020, and this second one was conducted throughout 2021. It took a bit of time to analyze it. It was a much more comprehensive survey, but it was a real opportunity to look into detail into what was happening to higher education around the world. The data was collected over a period of time between 15 February and 1 June, a period that really allowed for many people to participate in the survey. It was an online institutional survey, and we have considered only one reply per higher education institution. In total, we could thus count on 496 higher education institutions' replies from 112 countries and territories. We, of course, would have hoped for more replies, but this was really a very good sample, as it allowed for enough replies to be statistically relevant for the regions of the world, in the Americas, in Africa, Asia Pacific, and Europe. What is important, however, to notice is that you will see that we talk about the Americas plural, as the Americas region is a little bit underrepresented, mainly due to the very few responses we received from North America. And 92% of the replies, as you can see, from the Americas are coming from Latin America and the Caribbean, and less so from the US or Canada. But we were very pleased to be able to complement this study also thanks to collaboration with colleagues from North America. And you will see when reading the report that we have complemented the report with 5 regional perspectives to also show more in depth what is happening in those regions. The partners that have engaged with us in this process have been able to look at the results of the survey and to complement it with information from their region. So we hope you will have pleasure in reading those parts as well. The partners to the global survey itself are the following: the Association of Indian Universities, the Agence Universitaire de la Francophonie, the European University Association, the Hungarian Rectors Conference, NAFSA, the Association of International Educators, the Association of Commonwealth Universities, and the United Nations University. And they've all helped with developing the survey questionnaire, and also together with others, for that matter, for disseminating the survey into their networks. And we thank them very much for assisting with that. I think I can now hand over to Trine to go more in depth in the different aspects that we surveyed.
Thank you very much, Helic. And hello to everyone there. We are very excited to meet here today and to share with you the results of our work during the past year, because as it is mentioned on the title of our publication, we are looking at higher education 1 year into the COVID pandemic. I know that today we are 2 years into the pandemic, but the data that we are presenting here with you today was collected 1 year into the pandemic. It was a very comprehensive survey, as Helic just mentioned. I think we had nearly 75 questions included in the survey, so we will not be able to go in detail with it all here, but we have together chosen a few slides and results that we wanted to share with you here today during the launch session. Our survey was built on 4 major parts that you see here on the screen. One section looking at governance issues, and that's everything from financing to human resources to student enrollment, partnerships in different parts. So we will have a look at that. In the second part, we're looking at teaching and learning, and we're looking at different aspects there. Of course, the pivoting to remote teaching and learning, but also on the impact on internationalization, on the impact on exams and other aspects of teaching and learning. We have a section looking at the impact as well on research. And we also asked the respondent institutions to give indications on the impact in terms of community and societal engagement. So our presentation will follow this structure. We will pick a few results from each of these sections and share with you today. And you're very welcome, as Helic said, to share any questions that you have in the chat, but you're also welcome to share your experience to see whether some of these results resonate with what you're experiencing in your context. If you have seen developments since this year ago when we collected the data, we would be very interested to learn from your experience as well during this session. So let's start and let's move into the governance part. So the first part that we wanted to share with you was to look a bit on the impact on revenue. And of course, it's a challenge when we are serving at the global level to formulate questions that are relevant in all different contexts, because we have a very diverse range of countries when we are doing these global surveys. So we tried to simplify it to the extent possible and see, okay, around these four major categories, which is public funding, tuition fees, private sector funding, and other income, to what extent are your institutions experiencing stability or changes in terms of either increase in funding or decrease in funding? So first of all, what do we see here? We see that 90% of the institutions that responded to the survey indicate that they have tuition fees. They receive tuition fees. 74% indicate that they receive public funding. 73 indicate that they do have other income streams in addition to those two, and 62% are also receiving private sector funding. What you see in the graphs here are the results of those institutions concerned by the different funding streams. So for example, in the first line on public funding, you will see the results of those 74 institutions expressing that they receive public funding, etc. And this is kind of the same methodology that we have applied across the different graphs that you will see. So when we look at these results, first and foremost, I think that it's very positive to see that half of the institutions are indicating stability in terms of revenue, both in terms of public funding and tuition fees. However, it is at the same time somewhat concerning to see that there are an important number of institutions experiencing a decrease in funding, more so for tuition fees, where it's 40% of the institutions that are concerned, and a little less, but still almost a third of the institutions experiencing a decrease in public funding. Now, we are not looking at the percentages of the decrease or increase. We are just establishing what are the trends that we see at 1 year into the pandemic. In terms of increase, we also see that there is a higher chance that institutions would have an increase in public funding and less so in terms of increase in tuition fees. For the two other streams of revenue that we had in our categories, private sector funding and other income, it is pertinent to see that it's over the majority of the institutions that are experiencing a decrease in funding. So while these two are maybe not the core funding of the higher education institution, it is still an important sign to see that there is a decrease in funding for the institutions, which of course also impact the institution's possibility to act and implement different activities. As the most important sources of revenue for most institutions are either public funding or tuition fees, we will break it down and look at these two individually and look at it by region. So first of all, let's have a look at public funding and the impact here by region. And here, first of all, we want to highlight that when you look at Africa and the Americas, it's the majority of the responding institutions that are experiencing a decrease in funding, in public funding. On the other side of the scale, we have Europe, where the majority of the institutions are actually reporting stability, so stable level of funding, but furthermore, up to 23% of the institutions are actually receiving an increase in public funding. So while we know that Europe is a region where there are many public higher education institutions, we also see that it is a region where there is a high level of stability in this type of revenue stream. On the other hand, there are maybe less higher public higher education institutions in Africa and the Americas, but those that we do have are experiencing a more difficult situation with more institutions experiencing a decrease in funding. Now looking at the impact on tuition fees or academic fees, again, we see more or less the same situation where Africa and the Americas, where the majority of their institutions are reporting a decrease in funding, Whereas on the other side, for Asia and the Pacific, as well as Europe, the majority of institutions are reporting stability in terms of the funding. I did not have any more circles here, but I still want to highlight that we do, although that there is stability in the Asia and the Pacific and Europe, we do still see an important number of institutions, a third in Europe reporting decrease in funding in terms of tuition fees, and 40% of them in Asia and the Pacific. So what we see overall is a mixture between decrease in funding versus stability in some situations. So partially it's a good sign of resilience despite the hardship that the institutions are undergoing during the pandemic. But at the same time, we also see that in some areas, the situation is more complicated and that systems are more financially stressed in terms of income. On the other side, we also try to have a look at the impact on expenditure categories. And again, in order to simplify the questions that we sent out to our institutions across the world, we divided expenditures into 8 major categories around education and teaching, research, community and societal engagement, international collaboration and activities, staff costs, infrastructure, health, and other operating costs, as you see here. And with the same principle of asking them to report whether their level of expenditure is stable or if they have experienced an increase or decrease. And at the global level, we do see that the majority of institutions are reporting stability in the level of expenditures, both in terms of education, research, staff costs, infrastructure, and other operation costs. The only area where most institutions have experienced an increase in the level of expenditures are those concerned by health, as those universities offering, for example, having university hospital or offering health teaching in this field. On the other hand, in terms of the decrease, we do see, not surprisingly, a decrease in expenditure in terms of international collaboration and activities, of course, impacted by the different restrictions in place, making it more difficult to actually move beyond borders during this period. And we clearly see that here in the results, where we see 61% of the institutions reporting a decrease in expenditures in this area. But we also see almost half of our institutions, or more precisely 46% of the institution, seeing a decrease in expenditures related to community and societal engagement. George will come back to this later when we come into the section on community and societal engagement. We also circled here on the screen research, and even though it's not the majority of the institutions reporting a decrease in research, we still found it interesting to share with you that almost a third of the institutions are reporting a decrease in research expenditure. So this is important, I think, to highlight and to see whether this is a temporary halt due to the restrictions in place due to the pandemic, or whether it is a symbol of shift in priorities and less funding invested in research. This is too early to say with the results that we have in this specific survey, but this is, of course, something that we would like to follow up on in the next one, as Hillage mentioned. Overall, when you look at the different regions, there are not that big differences in the results that we see, but Africa stands out quite importantly. So that's why we have chosen to bring up the results for particular Africa in this case. For Africa, not that many are reporting stability in terms of the research category, and only in one of the lines you will see that it concerns the majority of the institutions, namely for staff costs. But on the other hand, you see an increase in many different areas, an increase in terms of education and teaching, an increase related to infrastructure, an increase as well, as we saw at the global level, in terms of health, and also an increase in terms of other operating costs. So while it remained more stable when looking at the results from the global perspective, we see that Africa, on the other hand, many institutions are confronted with a situation where at the same time, as we saw just previously, decreasing revenue streams, both in terms of public and funding and tuition fees, but this is combined with actually increasing level of expenditures on different levels. So a more complex situation. Finally, we also see if I can advance the slide. Yes. We also see that there is, as the global level, a decrease in Africa in terms of international collaboration and international activities overall and societal engagement. But more importantly, we see that almost half of the institutions in Africa are reporting a decrease in research expenditure. So much more importantly than what we saw at the global level. So I think this is also important to highlight because we are trying to scale up research capacity in Africa. And at the same time, we see that the pandemic, unfortunately, somewhat is slowing down expenditures on research, at least 1 year into the pandemic. We also had a more forward-looking question among those different questions looking at the financing of higher education, one where we asked the higher education institutions to express to what extent that they are concerned about the future of their institutions. And we had a scale for that with 4 different options between being very concerned, somewhat concerned, not really concerned, or very confident about the future of the association, of the institution. And what do we see here as well? We see that for Africa, the Americas, and Asia and the Pacific, the majority of the institutions are responding that they are somewhat concerned about the future of their institution. In Europe, on the other hand, we have a majority of institutions reporting that they are not really concerned for the future of their institutions. And if we add up the 2 positive and the 2 negative categories, I mean, for Asia and the Pacific and Americas, it would be more or less half and half. But when we look at Africa and Europe, the situation is more or less opposite, with 61% of the institutions in Africa expressing concern about the financial sustainability of their institution, whereas in Europe, it's the opposite situation, where we have 65% of the institutions that are not really concerned or confident about the future of their institutions. So a very diverse outlook, different types of impact in different regions, some degree of resilience, and more so in Europe than in other regions. But at the same time, we also see worrisome trends with a decrease in funding in other regions. If we now turn to have a look at how the pandemic has impacted the enrollment rates, for example, on domestic students, we do see that it's positive here across the 4 regions that we are looking at, that the majority of the institutions are reporting stability in domestic student enrollment. But we also see some changes. We see that, for example, in Europe, it is rather positive that more than 1/3 of the institutions are actually experiencing an increase in domestic student enrollment during the pandemic. There is also somewhat an increase in Africa, but less important. Here it's at 16%, and Americas and Asia in between those 2. And then we have the inverse trend when we look at the decrease in student enrollment, where we have more than 1/3 of the institutions in Africa experiencing a decrease in domestic student enrollment, and less so in Europe, where it's 13%. Americas and the Asia and the Pacifics are still in between those 2 regions. So again, overall positive that we see somewhat stability in the majority of the institutions across the different regions, but we at the same time see different terms of impact, where there is currently a more positive impact in Europe, with a higher degree of institutions reporting an increase in student enrollment, and unfortunately less so in Africa, where it concerns a third of the institutions that are actually experiencing a decrease. International student enrollment, this is probably not a surprise to most of you that it has had an important impact, and that we see across the board a decrease in international student enrollment. This is the same whether it concerns, I mean, it's a bit higher when it concerns exchange students rather than degree seeking students, but we did not see the big differences between exchange students within the same world region or from other world regions. It's more or less the same for the exchange students, a small difference between degree seeking students in the same region compared to degree seeking students coming from other world regions. But across the different regions of the world, we did see a decrease in international student enrollment. We hope, of course, that this will be somewhat a temporary decrease in international student enrollment linked to the restrictions in place due to the pandemic, but this is to be followed closely moving forward, to what extent that, when and if it will be able to return to the situation before the pandemic. Another slide that we wanted to share with you, and which I hope as well, or hope maybe not, but I think resonates with a lot of institutions around the world, is that we have seen an increase in the workload of academic staff. We also had a similar question concerning administrative staff, but we couldn't bring in all of the data here. So we, of course, invite you to look at the details and more information in the report. But just to show you that whether we are talking Africa, Americas, Asia and Pacific, or Europe, more than half of the institutions report that there has been an increase in workload for academic staff. The administrative staff is maybe a little less, but still it's the majority of the institutions as well, which means that we are in a period where, or it shows that institutions have done their utmost in order to find solutions and to pivot to remote teaching and learning to ensure that the mission of the universities continues during the pandemic. But this also impacts then backwards the workload of academic staff. And this is something that we need to monitor moving forward, whether it is again temporary or whether it is an increase that continues over time that may not be sustainable. So that's another finding. That's what we have chosen so far to share with you from the governance part, but there are of course other sections. We're looking at the impact on the strategic plan of universities, on partnerships, on other human resource aspects in terms of recruitment and salaries of staff members. So please do go to the report and look for more information there. And now I will start this one on teaching and learning, and then I will hand over to Giorgio for the rest of the presentation as well. So in the beginning of this section, we were, of course, looking at what extent institutions had been able to pivot to remote teaching and learning, because from our first survey, this was very unequal from one region to another, to what extent that they were able to propose remote teaching and learning. And I think that it's positive to see that 89% of the institutions were able to offer remote teaching and learning, and only 11% that did not. There is not that big a difference between the regions. Here you see that the two extremes is Europe and Africa, where Europe, it concerns 92% of the institutions, and in Africa, 82%. However, when we then ask them, I mean, those 89% of the institutions that did offer remote teaching and learning, we asked them to what extent that they are able to reach out to their full student population. We see at the global level that 86% of them are, of the students are able to follow the remote offer. It's a bit higher again in Europe, 92%, and a bit lower in Africa at 74%. But when we then dig a bit deeper and say, okay, how many of the institutions are actually able to reach out to their full student population, so 100% of their students. We see that the highest is in Europe, where it concerns 39% of the institutions, whereas this only concerns 14% in Africa. However, if we shift it around and ask how many of the institutions are actually reaching out to less than 50% of their student population, it only concerns 2% in Europe, for example, whereas it concerns a quarter of the institutions in Africa. So we see great progress compared to our first survey here in terms of being able to deliver and shift to remote teaching and learning. But the situation in terms of to what extent that universities are actually able to reach out to their student population is still very diverse from one region to another. We also asked institutions to what extent that they have experienced an increase in the use of digital tools. And because the results were so similar across the board, we have only brought in the global numbers in terms of those indicating an increase in the use of the digital tools. And on top one, you see here the use of online learning is coming up, use of digital communication and infrastructure to communicate with students, virtual exchanges and collaborative learning, capacity building, provision and training in the use of technologies, etc., etc. So I think it's not a surprise. We all know that we have been very reliant on digital tools in order to continue teaching and learning and research collaboration and others during the pandemic. The question is, of course, what this will look like when we move forward. I think that right now we still see quite a lot of institutions making use of online learning, but we also hope that the future would be more blended with a combination of, at the same time, the offer of face-to-face teaching and learning, and then other components where we can make use of online learning. However, I think that this also demonstrates that during the pandemic, we have seen a reinforcement of digital infrastructure across higher education institutions in all regions of the world, which of course also means that there are new opportunities moving forward in terms of how we deliver higher education, and amongst others, teaching and learning. We were also very interested in looking at how this pivoting to remote teaching and learning affected different disciplines differently, because that was one of the findings that we saw in the first survey. So what we did was asked the institutions to report back to us to what extent that it was possible to pivot to remote teaching and learning according to the ISCIT categories defined by UNESCO. So here you see the results where we see that, for example, from disciplines such as humanities, business and administration, law, social and behavioral science, most of the institutions are reporting that the curriculum can be taught from distance without a major impact. However, some of the other disciplines, and I read now from the bottom, health and welfare, agriculture, physical science, engineering, manufacturing and constructions, there we see a more important portion of the institutions indicating that the curriculum has actually been heavily impacted during the pandemic, because those types of disciplines may require more practical teaching and learning, access to laboratories or a specific material, which makes it more difficult to shift to remote teaching and learning. And I think that this is important to keep in mind as well moving forward, because when we imagine the future of higher education, it also depends on what type of disciplines that we are talking about. So this final slide for me, before I turn it over to Giorgio, is looking at the impact on the curriculum, because we were asking then as a follow-up question to the different institutions to what extent that they felt that the curriculum was impacted by the pandemic. And here you see that out of all our institutions, 7% said yes, there was an impact on curriculum. 36% said yes, to some extent for some specific program and courses. 37% said no, not really an impact on curriculum, but there were consequences in terms of the delivery or the implementation of the curriculum. And then 20% said no, there was no impact. All those where they did say that there was an impact, we asked them, okay, but how, in what way were the curriculum impacted? And those options that were selected the most frequently, you see them here on the screen. First of all, you see that some institutions are saying that curricula have a more theoretical rather than practical focus because of the restrictions. And others are saying more or less the opposite, saying that the curriculum became more practical in a sense, using case studies and problem-based learning. And we see that even though they seem somewhat contradictory, we see them in correlation with the slide just before on the different disciplines that lends themselves more easily to remote teaching and learning. It is very likely that they have become more practical, integrating more case studies and problem-based learning in order to engage with students, whereas disciplines where there is a need for more practical experience-based learning or access to laboratory, well, due to the constraint, it's likely that those curricula turned to be more theoretical during the time of the pandemic. The final one is the fact that institutions are expressing that curriculum has become more flexible and that students have more freedom in choosing their learning path. And we include that one as well because, of course, it's in the top 3, but I think it's maybe also an interesting one to keep in mind that we will have to export some of the lessons learned during the pandemic, and maybe this level of flexibility of allowing students to have more freedom in designing their own learning, may be something that we keep with us even moving forward from here. This was the beginning, and now I'm pleased to turn over to Giorgio, who will continue as we move and turn to the impact on internationalization.
Thank you very much, Trine. Thank you for giving me the floor. And as you said, speak about the impact on internationalization. And the first question on internationalization was if there has been already a change in internationalization strategies. And the answer is no. So at the majority of higher education institutions, the pandemic has not yet caused a change of the internationalization strategy, only at a little bit less than 1/3. However, at 43% of higher education institutions, this change is taken into consideration. So what we can conclude here is that the pandemic at the time that we conducted the survey had not had already an effect, but this effect can become visible now or in the near future. If we are looking at the regional distribution, we see that in the Americas, the effect of the pandemic was more pronounced in the fact that stimulated more a reflection and a revision of the internationalization strategies. However, if we are looking on the other side, we see that the lowest percentage of higher education institutions that have not changed their strategy is in Africa. But in Africa, we also have a very high percentage of higher education institutions that are thinking about it. Whereas if we are looking at where higher education institutions have not thought about changing the strategies, where there is more stability, if you want, this is in Europe. As you can see, the differences between regions are quite pronounced. Then, to the institution that replied that they have changed their internationalization strategy or they're thinking about changing internationalization strategy, we also asked if the priorities of some internationalization activities has changed. And in that case, if the importance of these internationalization activities has increased or will increase in the new internationalization strategy. And what comes out very clearly is that the importance of virtual exchange and international collaborative online learning, COIL, it's really the activities that has been prioritized or will be prioritized in the future because of the pandemic. But also, and this is also a very positive effect of the pandemic, international. So I mentioned about the importance of internationalization activities. And I spoke about the 2 internationalization activities that have been prioritized or will be prioritized in the near future. But on the other hand, if we are looking at mobility, and when I speak about mobility, I speak about student mobility, but also academic mobility, which we see a much more uneven impact of the pandemic. And we see really three different groups of higher education institutions for which the importance has either increased, remain the same, or decrease. So this is something which needs a reflection, because it can mean that in the future, some activity, and especially mobility, could remain important only at some higher education institution and not at others, thus the risk of increasing inequality. Next, please. So now moving to research, we have to say that the first and most interesting result that we saw is that research priorities have not changed because of the pandemic. It's only research in health and welfare that increased at about half of the education institution. But even in this case, we're speaking only about half of the education institution. So we can say clearly that the impact of COVID-19 on research priorities has not been so important as it has been the one on teaching and learning, as Trine explained clearly to you before. If we're looking at the regional level, however, once more we see a difference between the different regions, and once more we see that in Africa there is a high degree of inequality between different groups of higher education institutions. So we have a similar result as the one that we presented before, with three different groups of similar size identifiable. On the level of where research is conducted, so if higher education institutions focus more on research at local level, so community-based research, or more on research on global issues, we see that none of them has really been prioritized, but the prioritization, if it has happened in parallel. So both activities were prioritized in the sense of investing more in research in both types. At the level of delay in research activities, we see important delays, especially in the Americas and in Africa. So 77% of our education institutions are reporting delays in research activities. However, the main reason for delay is, if you want, kind of trivial, which is due to the fact that travel restriction made impossible traveling to attending conferences and do field work. However, we have to say that at some higher education institutions, also research projects have been impacted. So even if the impact is less, it's not so substantial, there is still an impact on research. Looking at some specific research activities, once more, we see that at the global level, there has not been a major impact of the pandemic, in the sense that the majority of higher education institutions are reporting a stable situation. However, once more, when we are looking at the regional data, we see that in Africa, there is a more important and more negative effect, in the sense, for instance, I can make example, you can read them in the report. The time for completion of PhD has increased. The publication in international journals has decreased. Next, please. Coming to research funding, this is a question which is pretty important, because it's showing how research funding has been impacted by the pandemic, and if the investment in research has changed or not. And once more, the result is kind of reassuring in the fact that research funding has not changed at the majority of higher education institutions that reply to the survey. And what is interesting here is also that we don't see a great difference between public and private higher education institutions in terms of research funding. When we go to the regional level, on the other hand, once more, we see some differences between the region. And once more, we see that the impact of the pandemic has been more important in Africa. Even if in Africa, the biggest number of higher education institutions are reporting no change, we have 40% of them reporting a decrease. This we can compare it to Europe, on the other hand, where 70% of higher education institutions are instead replying that research funding remains stable. Coming to research collaboration, even here, the majority of higher education institutions reply that research collaboration has not changed. And again, once more, at the regional level, we see much more stability in Europe comparing to Africa, where in Africa we see clearly three groups of the same size. However, here there is an interesting result, which is showing that Africa is actually the region where the biggest group of higher education institutions is reporting an increase both on collaboration, which is the left-hand side graph, but also in quality of collaboration. And this is very interesting and could be related to the fact that the digital transformation, the new opportunities open up by digital transformation, and the fact that the pandemic stimulated this digital collaboration, open up opportunities for research collaboration, especially in Africa, where maybe the starting point for research collaboration, especially at international level, was more complicated. Next one. Coming to the last part of the survey, the one looking at community societal engagement, we are seeing a very unequal impact of community societal engagement at global level. About half of the higher education institutions are reporting an increase, about a third instead are reporting a decrease, and the rest are reporting no change. Once more, a very diverse situation between different regions of the world. And if we are looking, for instance, at Africa and the Americas, we see that in the Americas, 62% of higher education institutions reported an increase in community engagement, whereas more than half in Africa reported a decrease. What is interesting here is also that this question was one of the few questions which was also present in the first edition of the global survey, the one conducted in 2020. And what we see is that at the global level, the situation has not changed, so it's more or less the same. Whereas at the regional level, we see changes in Africa and in Asia Pacific. In Africa, we see that the percentage of higher education institutions reporting a decrease has clearly increased from 34% to almost half, to more than half. Whereas in Asia Pacific, we see an opposite effect. We see that the percentage of higher education institutions reporting an increased community engagement moved from 39 to 47%. Next one, please. Coming to institutional autonomy, academic freedom, and value, we do not see an important effect of the pandemic, neither on institutional autonomy nor academic freedom, and not even on values. Even if on values, about half of them have rethought and redefined academic values. But the positive note here is that at those higher education institutions that have rethought their academic values, we see an increased importance of almost all the different values. Next one. So we are coming now to the conclusion of this very short presentation of the result. As Trine mentioned before, the report, it's much more ample than this small presentation, so there are a lot of fields we didn't touch upon. But here we wanted to present you really the main conclusions. And in this slide, we are kind of summarizing what, in our opinion, were the most striking results. First and foremost, we would like to say that despite some real preoccupation at the beginning of the pandemic, higher education institutions not only did not disappear because of the pandemic, but on the contrary, they show incredibly resilience. And I even would like to say that they show incredibly innovative spirit. The impact of the pandemic, therefore, has not been completely negative, but stimulated also innovation and accelerated some transformation which were already present in the world of higher education. And as we said before, especially in teaching and learning. On the other hand, on the negative side, we have to underline that the impact of the pandemic has been very uneven, and it has very, very uneven both between different regions of the world, but also inside the same region of the world between the different type of higher education institution. Looking at which one is probably the most relevant change caused by the pandemic, a change which could remain also in the future, it is definitely the transition to remote teaching and learning, and hopefully to a real distance and blended learning in the future. However, we have to pay attention that this transition to distance learning is not the solution to all the challenges created by the pandemic. But on the other hand, this transition brings with itself also new challenges that the higher education community need to overcome. So really, if we want to summarize in a simple manner, what is the major challenge for the future of higher education? It's really to maximize the opportunities that were created by the pandemic, but at the same time, it has to pay attention in minimizing the associated risks that have been also created by the pandemic. And among those risks, one, and very important one, is that these opportunities will be caught only by some higher education institution, only in some countries in the world. And therefore, inequality in higher education would increase. One lesson that the pandemic has really taught us is that global challenges, like the pandemic itself, can only be solved globally. So there are only global solutions to global challenges. And the contribution of a global higher education community to and for society, it's paramount. And it's even needed now more than ever. Unfortunately, I have to say that this lesson is far to be learned. And we can even see it in the news these days that a world where collaboration between countries, it's really the leading force, is still far from being a reality. However, this is something we should strive for. And this is something that us as global higher education community have the possibility of putting in place and making it a reality in a near, hopefully in a near future. Thank you very much. Next, please. Yeah, and here we are. So after thanking you for your attention to this small presentation, here you find the link to the global survey report, which is officially launched. And now I give back the floor to Ilic to do that.
Well, thank you very much, Trine and Giorgio, for a very good presentation of a very rich report. And indeed, we've not been able to touch on everyone, and you will see there are quite a few questions that were asked, and some of those you have been able to answer directly, but some remain open. And for the link, maybe that Justine Evans can put it in the chat, or maybe Giorgio or Trine, you can add it in the chat. We've had a few interesting, we have had many different interesting questions, and some remain still open. And I would like to start with the one by Dante Salto, which is a 5-point question, where I will ask them one by one, and maybe ask one after the other, if you could respond to those. So did the survey include all institutions, or just what we would call universities? Trine, what would you say?
Well, at the IAU, when we reached out to the global higher education community, we used data from the World Higher Education database that we are managing here at IAU. And that database is composed of both universities and higher education institutions. So we reach out broadly. However, you need to have at least a 4-year cycle degree in order to be part of that database, but that is kind of our pool of outreach. But we also reach out beyond that, because we use our partners and friends in order to share the survey online. So it is beyond only universities, it is really higher education institutions.
And then, Giorgio, what would you say? Did the survey include both private and public higher education institutions, and how?
Yes, absolutely. The survey included both private and public. Actually, we had 3 categories. We had public, private not-for-profit, and private for-profit. And the distribution, I can reply to the following question because they're related. The distribution we had is 60% of our respondents are public higher education institution, 30% are private not-for-profit, and 10% are private for-profit, which means that we were able to distinguish in the analysis, has not been reported here in this short presentation, but we did an analysis public-private, because the 10% of private for-profit, they are too low. So we had to merge the 2 categories of private higher education institution in one, but we were able to distinguish between private and public higher education institution and see if there are trends, different trends, depending on the nature of the institution.
Yes, and so Trine, will the survey data set be accessible to researchers interested in exploring the issue further? Actually, this is a question that is related to what do we want to do next? This is a report which is could probably be tagged a little bit more as a quantitative, or a set of quantitative data, rather than qualitative in a sense. And so what next? How are we going to proceed next? Maybe you can take that question, start there, and Giorgio, you may want to add to that. And then that could include that question, will we make the data set available to researchers interested in exploring the issue further?
Well, we of course encourage all those interested in getting in contact with Giorgio and I. And as Ilic is saying, we are pursuing different types of follow-up projects, because the difficulty when you look at the data at the global level is that we do not necessarily have enough data to explain differences between countries within regions. So what we do in that case is that we work typically with other organizations. For example, we are already engaged with 2 organizations in Africa that are conducting similar research, and we then collaborate in order to try to find further explanations and results using the combined data set. And we also hope to be able to follow up with qualitative interviews with some institutions in order to dig deeper and have different types of conversations about the results that we have. So I think that this is a good picture of what is happening 1 year into the pandemic, but it also opens up a certain number of questions that we would like to get answers to. So all those interested in collaborating with IAU in order to dig deeper, please do reach out to us, and we will do our best to share the data for further research.
Okay, thank you very much. Would you like to add something to that, Giorgio?
No, I would say on this question we have quite replied, so maybe we can move to the next one, and maybe there we have opportunity to speak about what are the next other next step on conducting further research.
Yeah. Okay, very good. Then Mike Winter is asking a question to which I can respond quickly, but it's an important one. He's asking if the survey is covering impact on assessment. As in particular, as he states it, online assessment has raised huge questions of integrity, privacy, and so on. And so, yes, the report has a few questions on assessment and the change in assessment. And for those who will read and access the report, please go to pages 82 to 85, because on those pages, you will find a little bit of the kind of responses that you would wish to find. And there's in particular a change highlighted there in the kind of assessments that are being used to measure exams and online exams, without going as far as looking at the questions of integrity, privacy, and so on. But that is in particular what we would wish to also look into more specifically in follow-up projects of different natures. So Mike Winter, if you're interested, get in touch and let's see if we can work together. Then Eva, you have a good question on which are the values that the institutions have prioritized. I'm not sure we have a detailed analysis of that, but maybe Giorgio, you would wish to say something about it, and Trina as well.
Yes, the question was in a way, if you want, a little bit biased in the sense that we proposed them 4 different values, and we were telling them have these values increased or decreased in importance. So it's a bit difficult to reply your question exactly, but what we can see is that which of those 4 values that we proposed was the one with the highest number of higher education institutions that reported an increase. And this one we can say, and that value is equity in access and evaluations, which is important because we saw that one of the main results of the survey is that this risk of increase inequality and the fact that higher education institutions already are replying that one of the values that they have to pay more attention is equity, it means that they are already conscious of the fact that there is a problem of inequality. So if they see that the survey showing that this risk of inequality could increase, they are also aware that this is something they have to tackle.
Thank you. Would you like to add to that, Trina?
If I can just add, I think that we saw that as well, because in some of the other questions under teaching and learning, we had questions about to what extent universities are taking different measures in order to ensure that students have access, and that we see different results as well per region, where in some regions universities have entered into a collaboration with communication companies in order to provide data to students. In the Americas, we have also seen that many institutions have actually provided devices to students without access to remote teaching and learning. So I think that this priority around equity and access is really also a demonstration of the efforts that the institutions have taken during these 2 years of pandemic in order to really ensure that students can continue their learning path despite the restrictions that we have been living under. So I think that at the same time, it's concerning because we have seen some students being excluded from their learning experience, but at the same time, we also see that universities have really pursued different means and ways in order to reach out to as many students as possible during this difficult time.
Yes, that's very good. Then we have Pai Obanya, who's expressing concern about the completeness of the analysis and is asking about the contextualization of the data sets. And there I would like to respond already, and you can react as well, Giorgio and Trina. But what we've really tried to do was first to ensure that we had this regional distribution of responses to understand what was happening on the different sides. And in reading the full report, you will see that there is much more analysis available there also on this contextualization that you're asking about. But we would be very pleased also to work with you on further contextualization of data, in particular when it comes to different regions of the world. Don't forget that in the annex to the report, we also have regional perspectives that we share with organizations from around the world. We've reached out to the African Association of Universities, and we will work with them in the future as well on next steps, analyzing the results from this global survey and digging deeper. So we will definitely go there, but you will see that the report is providing this contextual context that you're asking for. But maybe Trina, you would wish to add something to this?
Well, I think that, of course, it's difficult to explain. That's what I try to say, that when we do these global surveys, we are doing it to, first of all, to have a data set that provides us with the opportunity to look at it from a global perspective. What are the trends that we are seeing across the board? And then with the number of responses that we have, we can then look at it per region. But of course, each region is composed of different countries with different higher education systems. So we cannot, through the data that we have here, go into a specific analysis of each and every country. And even within countries, institutions are very difficult. So I fully understand that there is limitations to the type of data that we offer, but at the same time, we see it as a very important starting point in order to identify trends and to see where are regions, how are they confronting this pandemic in the different parts of the world, and then see, okay, let's pursue further, let's go into the context in order to understand further why we see the results as they are here.
Very good. Would you like to add to that, Giorgio, or shall we take the next question? No, just maybe one thing to clarify that of course, we are speaking here about a quantitative survey, and a quantitative survey by its own nature has some limitations. So we cannot go deeper in understanding the causes of our result and the trends that we see. But that's why, what we mentioned before, we are planning to conduct qualitative analysis to try really to understand. Here at this level, we can make hypotheses to explain some trends, but in order to contextualize and understand why it's like that, we definitely have to conduct some further research, and especially qualitative research. And this is something that we will do. Excellent. Then there is a question that is actually a follow-up question already, and something that we've dealt with in our webinar series on the future of higher education as well. This is Anna Kowalczyk asking about the IAU position on virtual mobilities. So in the report, what you will see is data on the transformation of internationalization. But on IAU's position on this, please do also go to our website, and maybe Trina or Giorgio, you can put the link to the webinar series and the recordings where we've debated internationalization of higher education on several occasions, and will do so again in the future. And there is a
huge project that Giorgio can maybe also relate or explain that we're involved in. But on virtual mobilities, we don't think that one kind of mobility can replace the other one, that virtual mobility can be a very nice add-on to physical mobility. That's at least the position that we advocate for, as virtual mobilities offer increased opportunities for many more people to access the benefits of internationalization in a different way. Yet we also certainly advocate for physical mobility as much as possible, because that is another experience altogether, and reinforces in a different way our capacity to relate to other cultures, to other ways of thinking, to other knowledge systems, etc. But the experts is in the room. So Giorgio, let me turn that question to you.
Yeah, you already replied to this question. So maybe just a couple of points. First of all, a matter of terminology. We tend to prefer saying virtual exchange than virtual mobility, because this term virtual mobility, it's something which already is an oxymoron, no? Like if you are virtual, you're not really mobile. Then one thing that we didn't do in the question, because of course the survey was very general, we didn't divide the different type of digital tools that are used in internationalization. So for instance, you saw in the presentation that one of the activities which were prioritized was virtual exchange and collaborative online learning. But of course, these two things are absolutely not the same. So if we wanted to be precise, we should also be precise in the terminology and understanding each activity, what is meant for. So virtual exchanges, as Ilge said, it's really a good add-on which can help internationalization, but reaching out a higher percentage of students which don't have the possibility of doing physical mobility, but definitely is not a replacement for physical mobility. Why is not? Because the learning outcomes are simply not the same. But this doesn't mean that we should not focus on virtual exchange. On the other hand, we should do that, because we should create a better opportunities for more students. But what we should really focus on, if we really want to make internationalization accessible for everybody, it's internationalization of the curriculum, internationalization at home. And COIL, for instance, collaborative online learning, it's a tool to achieve that. So I think that the discussion has to be more at the higher level. Let's say, why we internationalize and how do we want to internationalize our programs. And then there are the tools which can help us doing that.
Thank you very much. And then Hashish Nair is asking a question that I believe has been touched on for as much as possible in the constraints of and within the time frame of a presentation. But how has the pandemic affected research in higher education, and how can institutions try to overcome the effects? Maybe we can expand just a little bit more on that, and you may wish to pick up or to show again one of the slides. That's up to you. But there was also another question that I saw in the chat where somebody asked on if we had access to research funding opportunities. We do share on the IU website whatever research funding opportunity there is. And we invite you to visit the IU website regularly to see if we have things that we can relate to, and we try and assist where we can. But this is not something that the IU is doing per se, and this is also not something that the report itself and the survey in itself was questioning. It was looking at research financing. But Trine or Giorgio, would you like to maybe add a little bit on this question here on research?
Yeah, I can add here something on what I presented before. Of course, the time is short, and in few slides, we cannot really present all the result on the question on research. So therefore, first of all, I invite you to read that part on the report. But even that, it will be kind of limited, because even in the question, we couldn't touch upon all the aspects of research. But here I would like to stress again two very important points. First of all, yes. So your first question is, how has the pandemic affected the realm of research? Yes, it has affected. It has affected less than teaching and learning. We are seeing less impact, if we want, but this does not mean that there is no impact. And how it has affected? we saw delays in research activities. We saw an unequal impact in different regions, and also probably for different type of higher education institution. This is something we need more research, because we see that there is inequality even inside a specific region of the world. For instance, looking at, as I said before, the number of publications. In some regions, there is a group of higher education institutions which are reporting an increased number of publications, but there is also a group that is reporting a decreased number of publications. So why is that? Is it related to the country, which is something that we couldn't analyze with our data? Is it related with the type of higher education institution? And when I speak about type, I'm not speaking about private-public, because we had the possibility of analyzing that. I'm speaking, for instance, about the nature of the institution. If it is a comprehensive research-intensive university, it is a specialized. So there is an impact that we can see from our data, but we need more research to really understand why these results happen in that way. And how institutions can try to overcome this. Of course, first of all, we need to understand exactly what are the reasons behind. So if I take the same example, why some institutions during the time of the pandemic increase their number of publications while some other decrease it. So once we have the answer to this, then we can understand how to overcome this problem. Because on one end, we will have, if you want, good practices, and on the other end, we will have problems. And then we will have to see if the good practice are, of course, it's possible to translate them in different contexts, because one explanation could be some institution had resources and some other did not, so that the answer would be we should provide more resources to all institutions. But we need definitely more research, and this is also an invitation to all the researchers which are present here. We are open to engage and to further analyze the data and doing a follow-up project, which we are already doing, as Trine mentioned before.
Thank you. And then there was a question if university from Yaki Wang, if the universities in China have taken part in the survey. And so maybe you would wish to answer to that one. What I can already say is that in the World Higher Education Database, and we will send the link to the World Higher Education Database in a second as well, so you can have an idea of where how we work and what is the database that we use to reach out to universities. But we have sent it, the invitation to take the survey to all universities in China as well. So on the number of universities that have replied, or if Chinese universities have taken part, maybe Trine, you want to say something?
Well, I know that we did have responses from China, but China is not the country where we have the most replies. I don't know, Giorgio, if you have the exact number in mind, but overall we have in general less than 10 replies per country. Then we have a few countries where we have more than 10 replies, and one of the countries where we actually do have a lot of replies is India, because we had the Indian University Association as a partner for the survey, and they were very active in supporting the dissemination there. So I do remember that the weight of responses from India is more important than from China. We do, however, have a few replies from China in there as well, but I don't know the number. So Giorgio, if you have it, do not hesitate.
No, I don't have the numbers, but I want to stress one thing that you said, Trine, and you can easily see when you have about 500 replies from 120 countries. Mathematics is easy to do, which has good points, which means that our survey is really comprehensive in terms of countries. So we have a good global analysis of data. We can go to the regional level because we have enough replies from different regions of the world, but already you saw in the presentation at the beginning by Hillige that North America, for instance, we could not do an analysis in North America. And at the national level, this is very easy. I mean, only India is the only country where we have enough replies, which we could potentially do a national analysis. In all other countries, we don't. Simple as that. That's why our survey still remains really a global survey, presenting a global picture and having also, let's say, a nuance at regional level. But unfortunately, we cannot go to the national level, which is something would be interesting to complement with other data.
Yeah. We will probably go there also in the months and years to come to work more on that level. We were very, very pleased to have the 5 complementary papers to complement the global report. So please do read those. That's, I believe, a very good source of information. What we've also done is provide in the global survey report a bibliography of many other surveys that exist that could be seen as complementary to our effort to better state what's happening at the global level. And this report has the merit to exist in that it is really bringing together the different regions of the world, and the others are really digging deeper into either a topic or a region or a country or a set of institutions. And please do consult those as well, as they will definitely enrich the perception that we have on the various impacts of COVID-19 on higher education. I do not see new questions in the Q&A. Unless I have missed any, but I don't believe I have. So I would like to very much thank the panelists, Trine Jensen and Giorgio Marinoni, for excellent presentation. We hope that this has triggered many more questions on your side, and that you will have the opportunity to read the report, to look at the different opportunities and the different new research opportunities that are out there. We thank all those who have taken part today live for your many contributions in the chat and for the questions you've asked. And please do not hesitate to get back to either of us and to the IAU in general with further questions on the survey or follow-up projects that we envisage for the future. I would like to thank you all and give the last word to Giorgio and then to Trine to close this session. Giorgio?
Yeah, my last word is very simple. I mean, this for me, it's just a starting point. So what we really hope that with these results, what we are stimulating is more research, more interest for the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. We as International Association will go on working and studying this effect in the future. And we also hope that many researchers will take this challenge and go on and study what the effect of the pandemic in the short and then in the long term will be.
Yeah, and I would just like to add that thank you as well to all the institutions that have taken the time to respond to the survey, because we are trying to limit the questions, but there are so many important things that we want to follow up on. And the only reason why we can present these results to you here today is because universities around the world have taken the time to respond and provide the data that allows us to inform decision-making and research moving forward. So I just wanted to hand a thanks to the institutions as well.
Yeah, wonderful. Good. On your screen, you will see that the IAU work doesn't stop here. We have organized a whole series of new webinars to come. And to celebrate Women's Day, we have co-organized 2 specific webinars, one specifically with Evora, the European Women Research Institutions Association. And that webinar takes place on Thursday this week on gender equality in higher education and research across Europe. And on Women's Day, on Tuesday, 8 March, we will offer a second webinar together with Evora, and this time as well with ESA in Africa, on women in leadership in higher education, global and regional perspectives, both from Europe and from Africa, and at the global level, the IAU. So if you're interested, please go to the IAU website where all the upcoming webinars are on offer and register. We look forward to seeing you in these new dialogue and exchange spaces. Thank you very much for your time and for your attention, and looking forward to next steps together.